All right, we will go ahead and get started. So, good morning, everyone. Well, if it's still morning where you are, thank you so much for joining us. Today, it's nice to see you all. This is the NCCASC monthly webinar. This webinar is hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, or the NCCASC. We're based at the University of Colorado Boulder. My name is Heather Yoakum. I am the social science lead at the NCCASC, and I co-host this webinar series with Imtiaz Ringwala and other colleagues here at the CASC. And we bring you these webinars to really try to facilitate a discussion of science and research and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under rapidly changing climate. And also other environmental changes. And in our region, we really have a focus on the north central US. And so that encompasses the Missouri River Basin, the upper Colorado River Basin, the northern Rockies, and also the northern Great Plains. So got a lot of really cool area that we cover here. So before I introduce our speaker, just some quick logistics. We are recording this webinar, so you can probably see that happening. You can find all of our previous recordings on our website, and I can drop that link in the chat in a little bit. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, so please stay on mute during the presentation. After the presentation, you will be invited to unmute if you have questions that you would like to pose to our wonderful presenter today. If you have questions or comments that come up during the webinar, please put them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat and will pose those questions or share those comments with Jamie at the beginning of the Q&A session after her presentation today. So yeah, go ahead and put those in there. We'll end the formal part of the webinar and the recording at noon Mountain Time. And then after that, anyone who has kind of additional questions or comments or wants to stay for a little bit more in-depth conversation with the speaker is more than welcome to. We do that for usually about 15 minutes or so afterward. And so, with all of that logistical fun concluded, I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jamie Puhler. Jamie is a research scientist at the University of Montana, which is one of our wonderful NCCAS consortium partners. And she's also an ORISE fellow at the Missoula Fire Lab. She is a landscape ecologist who backs solutions that promote healthy forest ecosystems and support the communities that depend on them. Her recent work advances risk-informed wildfire planning by helping forest and fire managers identify where prescribed fire can benefit ecosystems and people the most. Jamie has a PhD in geography from Penn State University. So it's a real pleasure to welcome her as our speaker today. So with that, Jamie, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks to the North Central Cast for inviting me to talk today. As Heather mentioned, I'm kind of straddling two affiliations at the moment. I have a foot at the University of Montana as a research scientist there, and I also am currently at the Missoula Fire Lab working as a ORISE fellow. And today I'm going to be sharing some preliminary findings for a project that I've been working on with a research team that's looking at how we can better integrate seasonal dynamics into risk-informed wildfire planning. Now, of course, the slides are advancing. There we go. So I've been working in wildfire for nearly 15 years now, but I didn't come into this discipline the way that some people do. I didn't get my start as a wildland firefighter, so I didn't start on the operations side. And what originally really drew me to fire was how it works as a process and how under the right conditions, it can create real ecological benefits for ecosystems. And so during my PhD, I was really focused on this idea of fire as a process. So how it shapes ecosystems, how it interacts with vegetation, and how these patterns unfold over space and time. And I really loved thinking about fire in that kind of really strict ecological sense. But as I was writing up my dissertation in 2020 and 2021, the world around me was experiencing some extremely consequential fire events, more than we had seen in decades. So during that time, the January fires in Australia were happening. We also had the big fires happening in the Pacific Northwest. So there were entire communities that were facing impacts that were kind of far beyond the academic questions that I was studying and working on during that time. And so watching those events unfold, it made it really clear to me that for my next career step, I wanted to be more in an applied space and wanted to target opportunities to really do science and work that would directly support decision making on the ground, and to use science to really help inform the choices that managers are having to make real time under difficult circumstances and under a lot of scrutiny. And I've been really fortunate to land in Missoula, Montana, since completing my PhD. For folks who don't know, Missoula is a little bit of a fire science powerhouse in the United States. So you've got the University of Montana, where there's a huge community of students and researchers and faculty working on everything from fire ecology to social science to really cutting edge modeling. And then across town, out by the airport, we have the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory, which is part of the USDA. And it's kind of the birthplace for really fundamental fire behavior research. Things that happen over there include like combustion experiments and fuel bed characterization and really next generation fire simulation modeling. We also have Pyrologics in town. So this is a private company that's been behind some of the most practitioner relevant tools in the kind of wildfire decision making space used today in the US and abroad as well. And because all of these groups are in the same place, there's this constant exchange of ideas between researchers and modelers and practitioners. And so a lot of the science that comes out of Missoula, it's not just theoretically interesting, it's actually usable on the ground. And so for the last 2 years, I've had the chance to work on two sets of tools that have grown out of this community. Those are potential operational delineations, or pods. I'm just going to refer to it as pods because it's kind of a mouthful when you say the whole thing out loud. So pods, as well as quantitative wildfire risk assessments, which I'll be referring to as QWRAs. And these tools are both used across the country quite widely to help guide planning and response to wildfire. For folks who might not be familiar with these tools, I'm going to talk about pods first. So pods, they give us a way to carve up really large, complex landscapes into smaller, much more manageable units for forest and fire management. So instead of like trying to tackle an entire mountain range or tackle an entire watershed all at once, pods break up the landscape using pieces defined by features like roads or ridges or changes in vegetation that could be used as potential fuel breaks. And once the landscape is divided into pods, managers have a chance to look at opportunities there might be to harden the boundaries of these pods before a fire even starts. Um, and by implementing these tools during the pre-wildfire planning process, which is often achieved through proactive forest management, we can really start to reshape how fire would potentially spread across these landscapes that we have broken up into these different compartments. So this is a schematic that kind of shows what an after treatment might look like in a landscape where pods have been implemented. Again, some of these targeted actions include forest thinning, prescribed fire, and they can really change the structure of pods in a way that it can support safer, more effective wildfire response. Obviously, treatments don't eliminate fire altogether, but they can really influence how fire behaves, and they can give wild and firefighter crews better options when conditions can be really tough. Um, so pods can really help managers decide where those treatments matter the most and how to align them with their operational opportunities on the ground. The second tool that I've been involved with, again, are QWRAs, or Quantitative Wildfire Risk Assessments. And these have become incredibly popular over the last decade, especially in US states that are well resourced. And they're occurring at almost any kind of scale that you can imagine. So I'm showing a snapshot of the QWRAs that exist in Colorado alone. I've got four up here. There's a fifth one that I'm aware of. So Colorado's a little saturated in QWRAs these days. But I like this spread because it shows that kind of a snapshot of the different scales again that these are occurring at. So in Colorado alone, we've had two statewide assessments. There's also been QWRAs implemented at more of the fireshed planning level in northern Colorado. And there's also been QWRAs developed for individual national forests. And what these efforts all have in common is that they give managers a shared analytical foundation for thinking about wildfire again before it even happens. And they're really becoming a standard tool for improving decisions long before a wildfire event might even start. Um, QWRAs are pretty structured in the way that they're used to help us understand how wildfire might affect the things that we care about on the ground. So at a really high level, the way that risk is defined is using two components, which is how hazard meets impact. So hazard typically includes pieces that you might traditionally see kind of come out of fire simulation modeling. That include the likelihood that a wildfire would occur, as well as the intensity it might burn at. On the impact side, there's a lot of work that goes into capturing the assets and the resources that people really care about in the landscape, where they might intersect wildfire, and how that fire would either benefit or harm those things that people care about on the ground. Here's a little example of kind of the quantitative outputs that come with looking at these different dimensions of risk. So when we're talking about likelihood in quantitative wildfire risk assessments, typically we're referring to the annual burn probability for each point on a landscape. To estimate that, typically what happens is that a very large number of simulated fire seasons are run, often tens of thousands. Um, and we can see how often locations burn under very realistic ignition patterns, fuels, topography, historical weather conditions. And with that information, that's used to calculate the annual burn probability by dividing the number of simulated years in which a pixel burns by the total number of simulated years. And as a result, we get this value from 0 to 1 that represents how likely it is that a place would experience a fire in any given year. The other part of that hazard component is intensity, which is often described as conditional flame length probability. So this essentially means what's the range of fire behavior we might see at a location if it were to burn. To estimate these probabilities, fire behavior models typically calculate expected flame lengths based on information like fuels, topography, fire weather at the different points on a landscape. And this provides a distribution of flame lengths for every location that could essentially be thought as showing the likelihood of experiencing low, moderate, high intensity fire if that location were to burn. Um, and conditional flame length probabilities are essential because they really can help us understand the intensity of a fire and how it would impact things that we care about in these landscapes. Moving on to the impact side of risk, these are different ways that we capture exposure of the things that we care about. Um, this is a little bit of a snapshot of the different assets and resources that have been mapped in those different QWRAs that have occurred for Colorado. And as you can see, every QWRA, it can define its own set of resources and assets that are going to be incorporated into the analysis. They tend to be pretty heavy on people and property, power lines, water resources. But in the last maybe like 5 to 8 years, there's been a push to include more ecological values into these assessments as well. So we've started to see different wildlife species, different forest types, um, certain things like recreation are starting to be incorporated, especially places in Colorado where that's a big part of the economy. But the overarching goal is that we want to understand how these values are located in areas and what might happen when they burn. Sorry. Um, and so we're essentially wanting to see what's in harm's way before we even start thinking about the intensity or the impacts the fire might have. It's the water. Um, the way that we move into that impact from kind of those fire simulation modeling outputs that are incorporated into these analysis is that we use something called response functions. Response functions essentially describe how a resource or an asset is expected to fare if wildfire reaches it. So different values react to fire in different ways. Some experience clear losses, some might be neutral and see very little change, and some might even benefit under certain fire conditions. The way those kind of range of possibilities are incorporated is that each value is assigned a score ranging from -100 to +100 across the different flame length categories. So a negative score would represent at that given flame length, we would expect that resource or asset to represent wildfire harming it. Positive scores represent benefits, and values near zero indicate little expected effect. So again, these response functions can help us translate fire behavior into real-world consequences, giving us a consistent way to understand what wildfire would actually mean for the things that people care about. Um, I just a little plug, I put up a response function that I developed thinking about how we might incorporate forest carbon into these QWRAs. Up until this point, climate mitigation goals, forest carbon, hasn't really been explicitly included in a lot of these types of assessments. I won't be going into depth about the specific project I've been working on, but if you would like to stay in that 15-minute slot after the webinar concludes, I'm happy to talk more about carbon and the potential for achieving climate mitigation goals by using a tool like QWRA. And so essentially, once we have all these different outputs from our analysis, um, QWRAs piece together that information into a succinct, like kind of single product that shows us how likely a place is to burn, how intense that fire is expected to be if it does burn, and how the values in that location respond to different fire intensities. And again, the result is a single number, a single map that represents the wildfire risk to the things we care about. This is a snapshot of the final project that came out of this specific statewide quantitative wildfire risk assessment for the state of Colorado. And even though I've kind of set up my description of pods and QWRAs kind of in two separate bins, they actually do work really well together. Because they provide opportunities for us to pair operational boundaries on the ground with a clear understanding of what's at stake inside of them. So, for example, once pods are mapped, we can assign each of those individual pods a strategic response zone based on what wildfire would mean for the values that we know exist inside that area. This often gets mapped in these very like stoplight colors. So apologies to anyone who might be red-green colorblind in the webinar. But usually they get marked as these maintain zone, these protect zones, and these restore zones. So the maintain zone, that gets like the green color for and essentially says that we know that fire can really create acceptable and even beneficial effects within the zone. So under the right conditions, this could be an opportunity for managers to allow fire to spread within the zone, and knowing that we kind of harden those boundaries that under the right conditions, they might feel good about keeping it within this area. This is a great way to help us potentially leverage wildfire to increase the pace and scale of its beneficial effects. Pace and scale is something that people are always talking about, and there's a lot of conversation about how we're not going to be able to reach the pace and scale with forest thinning and prescribed fire treatments alone. We really need to leverage some of these wildfire events to help us reach those goals. So maintain zones could be a good opportunity for that. We also have those yellowish areas that often get labels protect. So, sorry, yellow. Oh, I flipped it around. Sorry, my code is wrong. So, we're talking about restore, which is yellow. So in these restore zones, fire can help move the landscape. These are areas where we think we can use fire to help us move towards more healthier conditions. And again, this could be an opportunity for people on the ground to use wildfire as a strategy to reach more desired conditions under safe and appropriate conditions. And then those protect zones, which are red, these are areas where we know that there are values inside these pods, um, where under any kind of circumstances, it's going to be unacceptable for wildfire to enter that area because it's going to have harmful effects. So often these are areas where there might be a lot of people on property inside those zones. So in these areas, often the strategy is to focus on keeping fire out or limiting the spread. So combining pods and QWRAs, it really gives fire managers a shared playbook for how to respond during wildfire that's grounded in both operational reality and the values that people care about. But it's also important to remember that um, when we kind of use these tools today, we're really only giving fire managers a like one single playbook. And that playbook isn't built around mild or even average fire conditions that we would typically see in the US. It's actually tuned to the most consequential wildfire that communities and ecosystems could experience and are often providing the biggest challenges for suppression efforts. So we're talking, QWRs are often heavily weighted to reflect conditions under 97th percentile fire weather data. So that's probably like peak wildfire season during the summer. It's probably really hot, dry, maybe pretty windy. Um, but we know there's a lot of other flavors of wildfire that exist beyond this just like one consequential fire scenario. Again, there's been a lot of conversation about leveraging unintentional ignitions that start away from people and property, that we can feel confident that are going to spread under much more mild weather conditions that could really help increase that pace and scale of stewarding beneficial fire. And we also know that forest and fire managers, they want to intentionally light fires to implement broadcast burns in ecosystems that are highly adapted to wildfire. And these broadcast burns are definitely not happening under 97th percentile fire weather conditions. And they're also probably not even happening during the same time of year that those consequential wildfires are happening. So, for example, in Montana, we usually have 2 weeks in the spring and 2 weeks in the fall where stars align for broadcast burning. So, that's a very different scenario than those consequential wildfires at 97th percentile fire weather data that are often used in these QWRAs. And another consequence of having that single playbook is again, that's like kind of built around those high consequent wildfire events, is that people and property end up really dominating the risk picture. And since QWRAs aren't really capturing a lot of nuance in the built environment, so it's not really capturing if a home uses firewise materials or if homeowners are kind of managing the vegetation around their house to create defensible space, because that nuance isn't typically captured, it's basically treating people and property as something that wildfire can never benefit. And, most of the time that's going to be true, especially under these extreme wildfire events. There's not going to be like a ton of nuance happening. But we know that people and property are um, very different than other values that might actually really benefit from those additional flavors of fire if we can start to capture those in these assessments. So, for example, wildlife, they have these seasonal life cycles, migration periods, and nesting windows, and very sensitive stages of development. Where fire might have very different consequences at different times of years. In some seasons, it could be harmful, and others, it could be beneficial. Um, but these nuances aren't really captured in QWRAs currently. So one of the challenges moving forward is how can we figure out how to bring more of those seasonal and ecological dynamics into these assessments, especially for values that don't respond to fire the same way throughout the year. So this is kind of the driving research question and research gap that I've been working on with our research team for maybe the last year and a half, 2 years now, is how do we integrate some of these dynamics in QWRAs so that maybe instead of handing forest and fire managers one playbook, maybe we can hand them a second one or a third one that again starts to capture more of the nuance that we know occurs around wildfire throughout the year, and also the values on the ground, those nuances for those values on the ground that respond differently to fire throughout the year as well. A quick plug that this is the team that I've been working with. Tyler is based in Missoula. He actually did his postdoc with the Northwest Cask, is now working with Pyrologics. Gabby is at NAU. Nicole and Kyle are at CU working in series. Kyle's like a colleague of Nicole and I's, and so we kind of tapped him for some of the to do a favor to help us wrangle some of the data that I'm going to show later on. But we're an all early career scientist team um, working to answer these questions in three priority landscapes at the federal level across the US West. That includes Central Arizona, Central Washington, and the Colorado Front Range. I'm just going to kind of focus on the Colorado Front Range and what we've been working on in that zone during today's presentation. But to answer that kind of driving research question, we've been really focusing on how we might tweak the QWRAs, especially since when you kind of get that final map with the stoplight colors, it's the QWRAs is the stuff that's under the hood that's really kind of driving what color those pods get colored in the end. And we've been specifically focusing on how can we tweak intensity under that hazard component to reflect different flavors of wildfire. And also, how might we tweak the response functions within the susceptibility category to capture more nuances for values that we know have seasonal dynamics that would respond differently to wildfire throughout the year. Tyler's really been leading the charge on tweaking that intensity component. He's been working with a fire simulation model called Wildest that Pyrologics runs. It's a deterministic model that can estimate fire intensity by using defined weather types built from real historical conditions. And each of those weather types represents a particular combination of wind, fuel moisture, temperature, and humidity. And Wildest essentially creates the full range of fire-relevant weather patterns for a given landscape. And a key thing about Wildest that makes it different than other deterministic fire behavior simulation models is that essentially weights the weather types within its modeling. So it weights weather based on how often each weather type would occur during the year and how much that weather type tends to reduce fire growth. And so the more weather type contributes to an actual area burned in the historical record, the more influential it is in the final intensity calculations. So the plot on the left shows kind of the full range of a wildest weather type. The different kind of components showed in this plot are 1 hour fuel moisture content. So for people who might be less familiar with wildfire fuels, 1 hour fuels are you can think of them as like kind of tiny sticks that have about the diameter of a pencil eraser. So pretty fine fuels on the ground that would carry a fire. We're also in thinking about what wind speed and also the direction of the is occurring within these weather types. And so you can think of the plot on the left as the complete universe of conditions that biologists uses to estimate intensity. Um, on the right, this is kind of a visualization of what Tyler has been doing. So instead of asking Wildest to kind of consider the whole universe of potential conditions and weight it according to the um, historical record, he's been asking Wildest to kind of to run the intensity under very these like kind of constrained um, weather type scenarios. So constraining weather types that we might see under kind of lower, more wetter, less windier fire conditions, a more moderate weather type or suite of weather types, and a more extreme weather type scenario as well. And so this approach gives us a way to capture how fire behavior might shift across the year, rather than relying on a single high-end fire weather scenario. And it really opens the door for risk assessments that better reflect the seasonal dynamics that the values might experience. Here's how constraining wildest to those like containers of wild weather types plays out for the Colorado Front Range. On the left, we have like the lowest scenario. So this is built from weather types again that probably have higher fuel moistures, lower wind speeds. Under these conditions, most of the landscape produces flamelings under 4 feet, meaning that fires are generally much more manageable. I think it's also important to recognize that even under this really kind of like desirable kind of fire weather conditions, that there are still spots in the landscape that produce flamelings over 12 feet. So those are areas that maybe there's just not a lot of opportunity to introduce fire under really safe conditions. In the middle, we have the moderate scenario that incorporates weather types that can have probably like drier fuels at that time, stronger winds. And we start to see much more orange and red in these areas, places where flamelings are starting to climb up to being above 6 to 8 feet in range. So under this condition, these fires would likely become harder to control. And on the right is the highest intensity scenario. Um, Again, this is going to capture those weather types that historically produce the most fire growth. It's going to have probably the most extreme conditions. And these are conditions where the flamelings we're starting to very routinely see them climb to be above 8 or even 12 feet. Um, and we can see that there's like large portions of landscapes that are probably going to support very active and under certain conditions, very fast moving fire. So again, by grouping wildest weather types this way, we can start to create these different scenarios that better capture how fire behavior might shift across different seasons or conditions. And it gives us a pathway to think about that hazard component much more dynamically within these assessments, rather than relying on that single fire weather assumption. Like I said, we're also kind of working on tweaking the seasonality portion of these QWRAs. We're working on developing 3 different archetypes that we believe would have strong seasonal dynamics. So these include resource-bearing plants, wildlife, and recreation. Again, we kind of expect each of these values to interact with fire differently across the year. Um, and it would be really important to capture the nuance that moves beyond just thinking of fire as being a single one-size-fits-all response. Again, we're also working in Washington, Oregon, so right now we're thinking about exploring this archetype of resource-bearing plants in Washington, wildlife in Arizona, and then looking at recreation in the Colorado Front Range, since again, recreation is a big part of Colorado's economy these days. Um, but even though we're kind of looking at different archetypes in different places in the US West, the goal is broadly the same. We want to capture the seasonal patterns that matter for how these values are seen, used, or relied upon, and to bring that nuance into the risk-informed planning. So to represent recreation on the Colorado Front Range, we've been playing around with using eBird data. Kyle was really helpful for helping us wrangle that data set. And what we've been exploring is using eBird user days. So for people who aren't birders out here, eBird is an app that's run out of Cornell, that people can keep their bird checklist. And there's also geospatial information captured in those checklists. So if a bird does decide to start a checklist while they're recreating, we have a geospatial record of like where they were, often how long they were traveling, the trail that they were on. So we're using those user days as a proxy for where people might actually be spending time outside for this particular recreational hobby. And so we've averaged 5 years of eBird data from 2019 to 2023, which gives us a dynamic monthly pattern of use. Not surprisingly, we were seeing a lot of use along trails, lakes, easy access points, but we do see evidence that those patterns shift throughout the year. So Gabby's put together this really nice GIF of how we see those patterns changing the Colorado Front Range on a monthly basis. And how we took that user data is that we identified the top 2.5% most visited eBird locations So you can kind of think of those as monthly recreational hotspots for birders. And then for each hotspot, we ran a simple binary viewshed analysis to capture what that person might be able to see from that point on the landscape, with the assumption that if you're a birder, you're going to be looking around, looking for your birds, right? You're not necessarily really focused on that one point on the ground. Um, After running the viewshed analysis, we weighted each viewshed by how popular the hotspot was in that month. And then we used a log scale so that the most heavily visited sites carried more influence in when we were exploring this data. Um, and then we normalized each month's surface from 0 to 1, which gave us a more clean, more comparable representation of what can be seen from these high use recreation areas for birders, and gives us a sense of how popular they are. Um, we're still kind of working on developing this archetype. Next steps are we're going to work on developing the response function that captures these different seasonal dynamics. And that will give us an opportunity to think more about how fire could affect recreation in a more dynamic space for QWRAs. Um, just to wrap up, here's some of my key takeaways from this talk. So again, risk-informed wildfire planning is really growing rapidly in popularity at different scales in the US and abroad. But right now, we're kind of stuck in this space where the science is really only handing forest and fire managers a single playbook. Um, and because it's really that playbook is really focused on these really high consequence scenarios, we're missing really important variability, not only in the different kind of flavors of wildfire, but how different values might interact with fire on the landscapes. And so giving forest and fire managers more nuance in that space and more additional playbooks um, could really better guide and better tailor some of the on the ground situations that they're facing these days. Again, how we're kind of addressing this gap is we're working on tweaking the intensity and the susceptibility um, components in these QWRAs, using wildest to um, offer a workflow that can be used to look at multiple hazard scenarios. And then we're also, again, developing these 3 different archetypes that we think would have important seasonal dynamics that should be incorporated QWRAs, focusing on recreation in the Colorado Front Range and using eBird data um, to demonstrate that there is a lot of seasonal variability, and that kind of nuance would be beneficial in incorporating QWRAs if recreation is something that's valued in these assessments. Um, and with that, like I know there's gonna be a lot of time for discussion and more informal discussion after the webinar. I will just leave my email up here. Happy to talk to folks more about risk-informed wildfire planning. Also to like I'm definitely open to connecting folks to Tyler or Gabby or Nicole to if they have like very in the weeds questions that I might not be able to answer about some of this work. And I think Heather, I'm ready for questions.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. It's funny because I feel like I see you in a more like administrative cat staff capacity all the time, and to
Oh
actually
no,
like get to hear about your
you're
research is
like
so
this person's
exciting.
smart.
Yeah. Oh no, we already knew that. But no, it's just always so much fun to see to get a little bit more in-depth look at what folks are actually doing. So
Mhm.
yeah, I don't see any questions or comments or anything in the chat right now. So if you all have questions or comments for Jamie, feel free to unmute yourselves and go ahead and just ask. If there's a lot, let's start using the raise hand function just for that. But for now, you all can just sort of go. I'll give you all a chance to ask before I launch into my questions. All right, well, maybe I will take yeah, I will take advantage of being the person here and just one question I had for you about I think this use I have a bunch, but I think this use of eBird for kind of a proxy for recreation and you know also sort of wildlife like because right like if they're looking at birds there's birds there so that kind of maybe gives you
Yeah.
some of that. I'm wondering have you all thought, or is there like any thought about incorporating like other, I don't know, I was just thinking like there are like hiking apps that you could like get that information from, or like Strava, or like things like that that people do for like biking or hiking. I realize it might not give you the same sort of like wildlife info, but yeah, I
Yeah,
don't know.
when we were brainstorming with Kyle, because again, Kyle's special like is focused on kind of wildfire and recreation these days and is grappling with these really kind of publicly available data sets that have geospatial information tied to
Hmm.
it. All trails and Strava did come up. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways we could have gone
Yeah,
that
yeah.
route. I didn't mention this during the talk, but like, when recreation is incorporating QWRAs these days, it's really tied to infrastructure. So it's kind of like where are the campsites? Like where's the
Hmm.
trail? And again, those are kind of I kind of lump those in those people and property components where like fire's probably always gonna negatively affect it, especially if you've got a campsite burning down. So I to answer your question, we did kind of talk about all trails, maybe Strava. I think they would have fit like a similar niche that we were looking for. Like, let's look at data that kind of shows how people are actually like kind of recreating. Um, and it's not tied to something materialistic, I guess. So yes, we did kind of talk about other data sets. And then we kind of went with eBird in the end. I think it was just like a little bit easier to kind of grapple with that data set. I mean, eBird's managed by Cornell and it's like a citizen science project, so I think it's probably just lends itself a little bit easier to play with that data than, how like the Strava or the All Trails data is stored.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm just as a non-data science person, I'm always really intrigued by like these new interesting uses for data we have in different ways. So
Totally.
that was
I
sort
always
of
get
the,
freaked out. When I was in the geography department, there was always people talking about, using Twitter data at the time. And yeah, it's also just a reminder that they're tracking all of our data and
yeah. Molly
signals.
has her hand up, so we'll kick it to Molly, and then Jeffrey, I see your question in the chat, and we'll get to that one after Molly.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Great presentation. Really nice to hear about all the exciting work you're involved in. Um, I was thinking, as you were talking, one of a sort of new partnership, and I don't think Stefan is on today, but I don't know Brian or Megan or if other folks from the CU team have anything to add about this, but we've been sort of building a new partnership with the Colorado Governor's Office of
Mm.
Climate Preparedness and Disaster Recovery. They
Mhm.
are in the process of updating, I'll put the link in, their climate preparedness roadmap, which they first put out actually to Jeff's question, came out sort of after the Marshall Fire and was
Okay.
intended to try to help, pull together information and a little bit, well, anyways, help the state agencies be a little more prepared for some of these changes and impacts. And your work seems quite relevant to some of the issues that they're concerned about, wildfire risk and other things. So I wasn't sure if you had any engagement with them. I wasn't sure if any of the folks on my team or at CU who may have had some conversations with the governor's office that's working on this have mentioned this work, but it'd be great to make sure it's connected.
Yeah, I think so. I think that'd be a really great connection. Yeah, we've been more connected to, um, yeah, I would say like federal landowners in this space. I mean, our group has a lot of kind of like colleagues in CFRI, so it's the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. So I think that's probably the most relevant kind of state level organization
Mhm.
that we've
Mhm.
been working with. But yeah, I would say like these are the kind of tools that something like that should be looked at. And yeah, I'd be happy to follow up on any connections as you might seem.
Yeah, yeah. If you wouldn't mind maybe sending us the links to those reports that you showed on your screen
Oh
or some
yeah,
of the
yeah,
analyses that you guys have done, we'll make sure that they're aware of them and see if they have follow-up questions
yeah. Okay.
if we point them in your direction.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yay. And just to follow up on that, we may have to follow up with you on some wind questions about that, because that was one of the questions that their folks had. And as you were presenting, I wrote down, I was like, ask Jamie about wind.
About the winds,
So
yeah.
yeah, we'll get back to you
Okay.
Um, yeah, okay. So from the chat, thank you for the presentation and curious if and how the risk-based modeling approaches you discussed can be applied to non-forest ecotypes. For example, the grass-fueled Marshall Fire in the suburbs west
Yeah.
of Denver. I know you kind of touched on this a little bit already, but and other grassy open spaces. So,
Yeah, I think the grassland is a super interesting question. I mean, I think there's a lot kind of going on beyond the science. It's also kind of like more like kind of political kind of stuff. Maybe not political, but like a lot of these tools came out of the Forest Service. And so they're very biased towards forests. And I there is a lot of interest in incorporating grasslands. Um, my understanding that grasslands can also be really tricky kind of with the fire behavior simulation modeling because they can be they're like really flashy and then like in certain areas, like for example, working in Arizona, right, which has a really big monsoon season. So you get these like really big green up periods that are happening in the grasslands that can really drive or dampen behavior like based on how green the grasses are. So my understanding is that like that's also something that's kind of tricky with how these are incorporated. It's just like really tricky to kind of model some of those yeah, more only grassland areas that would drive fire. I mean, there's really smart people working on that. It's getting better. My understanding that's like kind of one limitation to like why they're not incorporated as well these days. And also, I think it's kind of like that it came out of the Forest Service. It's very biased towards forest. But I know that was something that I've been like kind of interested in, and like for a little bit was thinking about putting in a proposal for the North Central Cast on that is like how you can incorporate even just more grassland values like. I haven't really seen like just like kind of looking across the West, I haven't seen a lot of kind of like values that ranchers might have, for example. I know that's kind of moving more on private versus kind of maybe like public lands that are grassland, but that's like one of the nice things about these QWRAs is that they tend to be very all lands, if they're at like larger scales. Um, so that's something I'm interested in, like a gap I have seen. I feel like things like ranching, and things that may be like more explicitly tied to those grassland values and maybe not less so forest currently aren't very well represented. Um, so I guess to summarize, like I think they're like totally applicable. I think those my understanding is there's some limitations with how good the fire behavior modeling might be across the year in those grasslands. And I think there could be like really real opportunity to really develop values that um, I have seen be kind of absent in terms of grasslands in these assessments.
yeah, no, that's a great question and a really good point. And so interesting too, since the Forest Service actually manages a lot of grassland.
Yes, yes, yeah.
But
So
it
I guess
makes
like
total sense that they would,
yeah.
yeah,
So
that,
I guess
yeah.
I was a little catch-all with that. But when you look at them, it is very
Yeah.
again, for a while, it was only kind of people on property in these assessments because they were made to help with managed wildfire incidents. And now it is starting to try to incorporate some more ecological values, but they tend to be pretty tuned to things I would say is like tied to forest.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually a perfect segue to the next question that we had in the chat, which is from Janet. In your opinion, what are the most crucial ecological and maybe cultural data sets that should be, and then or always, in models and wildfire plans?
Ooh, I mean, I think it's really tied to place. So I don't think there's really like a catch-all kind of thing. Something that's really great. Okay, I'm gonna go one direction and I'll come back. I kind of definitely presented these as like tools. Like these are really cool tools out there. But for me, like the thing that I think is really great about PUTs and QWRAs, it's not the it's not the final outcome, it's the process. Like when these are done really well, um, I didn't show this slide. Um, but for a little bit I was like, oh, maybe I'll show, some of like because these are really taking off in the US. During the bipartisan infrastructure law, when that was passed, there was $100 million earmarks for parts alone. Um, Ignore the AI. I feel like the AI is really just like people use random forest and machine learning algorithms, and they've kind of, trying to use this. So don't get too excited about the AI. But I wanted to show this because you can see there's a lot of like maps and like corolla markers, and people looking at maps. Like that is like integral to like developing these pods and QWRAs. Like the idea is you get like the decision makers and stakeholders in the room and they like look at physical maps and they draw on them and they mark what would be important. So that's why I'm kind of hesitant to be like, these are the things that like would be really critical. Um, I mean, obviously, like I feel like the ecosystem servicey things are always important, right? Like water is always a really big deal, especially for a place in Colorado. And and there's been a lot of interest, I would say, growing in kind of post-fire soil erosion into those systems. So I think water is something that's always really popular. Um, I'm very interested in carbon. I feel like there was a lot of interest during Biden when that was really taking off in his administration. Less so these days, but I would love to see like more climate mitigation goals incorporated for folks that they feel like that's important on their landscape. Um, the cultural stuff is really tricky. Like, I mean, my brain is going towards more like values that like tribes would have. And those are always really tricky because like, it's not always ethical to map them. Um, we did a little bit of we had some conversations with the tribe in Washington, and it was really interesting talking to them about this process because for them, they were like, well, we would never, like, all values are equal to us. We would never rank them. And, like, there is, like, a step in QWRAs where you're asked to rank which of your values are most important to least. And they're like, we just would never do that. Um, so I think that was like really eye-opening for me and like also kind of with the ethics around, mapping cultural resources. I am kind of a little bit kind of like, well, I don't know if maybe this is not the right, tool to use for those kinds of things, even though people do kind of try to incorporate things like archaeological sites and stuff like that. So yeah, sorry, very like vague answer, I guess, but like, I'm just having to be like, these are the most important because I think something that is great about these tools is that when they're done well, it does incorporate a lot of place-based local knowledge and input, and those are the folks that should be deciding what's really important on the ground.
Yeah, very well said, Jamie. Kim, nice to see you. Hi,
Hi,
go
nice
ahead.
to see you. Nice to see you too, Jamie.
I can.
Um, I just have a question, and I may have missed this because I was a little late coming in from another meeting. With the delineation of pods, is that meant to be a fairly permanent boundary, or is the idea here that the delineation of where these units are might change over time as the fuel conditions change or
Mhm.
infrastructure changes, or are they just so new that that hasn't really been addressed yet?
I think they can change. I am aware that of some groups that, they've reconvened, I don't know, 5 years later and kind of assess like, okay, does this still work? Does things have to update? So they're definitely flexible if folks have the resources and the time to kind of assess that. But that being said, I feel like, some of the features are quite permanent. A lot of times they're attached to like roads. Um, and I mean, the idea is that like this is kind of a way to avoid kind of those random acts of restoration where you're just kind of, treating on the landscape without really a plan. So like I, even though like I have heard of people coming back, I feel like best case scenario is like, okay, we've identified these spots. We've like some of them are permanent, the ones maybe not so, like we've really kind of hardened them. So like that's language to be like, we've kind of gone out there and done treatments to like give us more of a safe buffer to work with. Um, so they can be tweaked. I think kind of for efficiency, it'd be great if it's like we keep building on this plan and we're just checking
Right.
in to make sure everything's good.
Thanks.
Other folks, other questions? Oh, Janet, do you want me to come back to my wind question? That might be one that we table till after we stop the formal recording because it gets a little in the weeds. But
Yeah, I might
yeah,
not be
happy
the
to talk
best
about that.
person, but I can share what I know. I know they use Wind Ninja. But
All
if I
right,
can't
well,
answer the wind, I can reach out to Tyler. I'm sure I can get any. very in the weeds questions answered.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, Molly, did you have a question?
Well, no, I was just going to say, yeah, unfortunately I can't stay on for the conversation afterwards, but definitely the topic of, yeah, understanding sort of wind dynamics, probably not only
Yeah.
as it relates to wildfire, but other kinds of stressors as well, is
Mhm.
really of interest to the Colorado Governor's Office. And so if there are folks on your team, Jamie, yeah, that have some experience with knowing, yeah, like what kind of data is out there, what kind of modeling
Yeah.
is out
And
there. It would be great to connect with you on.
yeah.
And then I'll just mention it for others who may be interested in that topic. The National CASC has a Climate Adaptation Technical Services Program. We call it the CATS team. And they're actually going to spend a little time doing some sort of summary and synthesis and scoping of some work in that wind space to see if there's
Yeah.
some targeted work that they might be able to help with to support the Colorado Governor's Office. So I don't know if we had shared that update, Heather, for example, with you and others in the CU team, but hopefully we're, yeah, be able to pull some thinking on that together. And Jamie, if, yeah, like I said, if there's folks on your team that you recommend we talk to, please let us know.
Yeah, totally. Wind definitely, when we were talking to folks in Colorado, the wind came up. It does seem like that is a big driver
The
of,
wind comes
especially in the,
up often in
especially in the prescribed,
Colorado.
yeah, especially in the prescribed fire space. Like, it's interesting
Yeah.
in Colorado. It sounds like they kind of have weird burn windows that they go for. That's like very different. Like, it seems like they try to push their windows more in the summer because I guess the wind's really strong in the spring, if I remembered correctly, in the spring. So yeah, that definitely came up, especially talking about prescribed fire.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, thank you again very much, Jamie, for the wonderful presentation. And thank you all to everyone who is here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and then we can kind of continue the conversation. So.